I welcome our two witnesses today. We have Dr. John Lott, Jr., who's an economist, world-recognized expert on guns and crime. He served as the Senior Advisor for Research and Statistics in the Office of Justice Programs and in the Office of Legal Policy in the U.S. Department of Justice, and has held research or teaching positions at various academic institutions, including the University of Chicago, Yale, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, UCLA, and Rice. And he was the chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission during 1988 to 89. He holds a PhD in economics from UCLA. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman noted John Lott has few equals as a perceptive analyst of controversial public policy issues. He's a prolific author for both academic and popular publications and has published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed academic journals and written 10 books, including More Guns, Less Crime. His most recent books are Dumbing Down the Courts and How Politics Keep the Smartest Judges Off the Bench. He's been one of the most productive and cited economists in the world. From 1969 to 2000, he ranked 26th worldwide in terms of quality-adjusted total academic journal output and 4th in terms of total research output. Among economics, business, and law professors, his research is currently the 14th most downloaded in the world.
Dr. Lott, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Briggs, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak to you all. I desperately want to do something to stop the horrific violence that Representative Lee and the other witnesses have so movingly described this morning, but I want to do something that actually matters. Unfortunately, many of the proposals won't help or will actually make matters worse. Take background checks on the private transfers of guns, known as universal background checks. There isn't one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped if such a law had been in effect and had been perfectly enforced. Worse, no one is talking about the massive errors in the background check system and how it overwhelmingly discriminates against Black and Hispanic males being able to go and defend themselves and their families. We hear calls for bans of so-called assault weapons, but the vast majority of firearms in the United States, including these assault weapons, are semi-automatic guns that are functionally identical. Even the influential Associated Press style book acknowledged earlier this year that terms such as assault weapon and weapons of war convey, quote, little meaning and, quote, are highly politicized, end quote. The AP makes it clear that these firearms are not used by any militaries around the world. Despite the references a couple times, they are not automatic weapons. President Biden has frequently said you only need an AR-15 to hunt deer if the deer have Kevlar vests. But an AR-15 functions exactly the same as any small caliber hunting rifle, firing the same bullets with the same rapidity and doing the exact same damage. Banning guns based on them looking like military weapons, the key phrase is often military style, makes no sense. Of course, banning all semi-automatic guns, as President Biden has repeatedly called for over the years, would mainly affect law-abiding citizens, while I guess at least is logically more consistent than banning military-style weapons. It would make it much more difficult for Americans to use guns defensively. If you want to ban all semi-automatic rifles, what's the alternative? A manually loaded gun, where you have to physically put another round in the chamber after you fire each shot? If you face multiple attackers, or you fire and miss, or you fire and wound but don't incapacitate the attacker, someone may not have the luxury of time of manually reloading the gun to be able to go and protect themselves. Claims about these laws having overwhelming support are based on surveys that simplify and mischaracterize what these laws do. Surveys show that when Americans are accurately informed about what these laws change, with strong support changes to strong opposition. There's 4 facts I'd like to try to get across. 1, over 92% of violent crime in America has nothing to do with firearms. That percent has remained fairly constant for the last couple decades. The vast majority of violent crime has nothing to do with firearms. The second point is, while the U.S. media doesn't give much attention, if any, to coverage of mass public shootings in other countries, Mass public shootings per capita are relatively low in the United States compared to a number of countries in Europe, as well as the rest of the world. Over the 20 years from 1998 to 2017, the United States had 1.1% of the world's share of mass public shooters and 1.8% of the mass public shooting murders. Both are significantly less than the U.S.'s 4.6% share of the world population. People don't take into account that the United States has over 330 million people. You can't compare it to a country with 5 million or even Germany with 80 million without adjusting for the different sizes in population. Many of these countries with much higher mass public shooting rates and deaths have very strict gun control laws. The third fact is 94% of the mass public shootings occur in places where civilians are banned from having firearms. We've heard many times today about the Buffalo mass murderer earlier this year. If you read his manifesto, he spends a great deal of time, like many of these killers do, explaining why he picked the target that he did. I'll read it to you. His manifesto says, quote, attacking in a weapon-restricted area may decrease the chance of civilian backlash. Schools, courts, or other areas where concealed carry are outlawed or prohibited may be good areas of attack. Areas with strict gun control laws are also great places for attack. I can give you quotes from one manifesto after another, from one diary after another, and they're on our website at crimeresearch.org, where these killers, time after time, tell you, but the media ignores the fact, never reports this part of what's in their manifestos. The fourth fact I'd like to get across is the most vulnerable people in our society benefit the most from owning guns. If my research convinces me of anything, there are two groups of people who benefit the most from being able to go and protect themselves. One are the people who are most likely victims of violent crime. That's overwhelmingly poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. Police, anybody who's read my academic research knows that I think police are extremely important. But police understand themselves that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred, and that raises the question of how people should act when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. And the research shows overwhelmingly that by far the safest course of action for people to take is to have a gun. And that's particularly true for people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a male criminal doing the attack, and when a man is attacking a woman, there's a much larger strength difference that exists there than when a man's attacking another man. We've heard a lot about different attacks that occurred this year.
Dr. Lott, can you finish? Will you be finishing soon?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. But if you go through the list, the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas was a gun-free zone. The Tulsa, Oklahoma hospital shooting was a gun-free zone. The Walmart mass murder in Virginia was a gun-free zone. I could go through others. But our research shows that overwhelmingly, when you see these attacks, they occur in schools where teachers and staff are not allowed to carry. It's not by accident. Thank you very much.
So I've been in elected leadership for 12 years. And when I first got elected in 2010 to the State House, Sandy Hook happened shortly after I was in the State House. And being a former military guy who served in a deployed environment and want to find solutions to problems, I started doing research like a good lawyer does. And I saw that in Florida at the time, all of these shootings that were occurring nationwide were happening in gun-free zones, especially in schools, where you have those perpetrators who want to go in and kill as many defenseless children as possible are going to go to a place where they know that people aren't armed. And at the time in Florida, we didn't have school resource officers in every single one of our elementary schools. So I filed a bill that would do away with gun-free zones specifically in our schools and develop a policy and a program. I actually worked with Sheriff Demings, Val Demings' husband, on this with the Sheriff Association, where we would have certified law enforcement officers with concealed carry permits that would go through a specific gun safety, school safety course, just like the SROs go through, and put those individuals in our school, former current military, former current law enforcement, that would go through a training course that would be able to respond to these type of incidents. Because what Mr. Lott's research has shown, and this is from his, this is today, 94% of mass shootings between 1950 and 2019 occurred in gun-free zones. That is a fact. Sandy Hook's a gun-free zone. Pulse nightclub was a gun-free zone. Parkland was a gun-free zone. The FSU shooting that we had in Florida was a gun-free zone. And Uvalde was a gun-free zone. And regardless of, we will never get evil people out of this world. And regardless of what tool they're using to accomplish the evil they intend on accomplishing, by not having somebody there who is properly trained, who is armed to be able to respond to these type of atrocities, is what is putting all of our children in these horrible situations. And I fought hard to get that changed in Florida, and I believe if that bill would have been passed before Parkland, those kids in Parkland would have been saved, because that shooter would know that if he was going to that school, there's gonna be armed, trained people on the other side that could respond to that. So I wanna thank, and I'll yield the remainder of time to Mr. Lott to comment specifically on the gun-free zones and through acts of Congress of what we've done to make gun-free zones a target for these perpetrators who know that when they walk into a school grounds, there's not gonna be anybody there that's gonna be able to respond in a timely manner. And in Florida, and in my district, average response time's 2 to 4 minutes, depending on where law enforcement is. And we all know how quickly the travesties of this evil can occur in such a short period of time by not having somebody armed and trained and able to respond. Mr. Lott, I'll yield the remainder of my time to you.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I mean, you can just read the diaries and manifestos that these killers leave behind. They make it very clear. They're not stupid. Their goal is to go and kill as many people as possible. And they know if they go to a place where victims can't defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people. We looked at all school shootings of every type, from an accidental discharge all the way up to a mass public school shooting from 2000 on. There are 20 states that have armed teachers. It varies the percentage of schools in different states, but you're talking about literally thousands of schools. And yet in that entire time, there has never been one single attack where anybody's been killed or injured during any school hours where teachers and staff are able to carry. Every single one of these attacks where anybody's been injured or killed have occurred in schools where guns are banned. And you know, would you rather have a sign in front of the school that says this school is a gun-free zone? Or would you rather have a sign in front of the school that warns potential attackers that someone that they can't identify beforehand is going to be able to possibly stop them? You know, having one officer in a school in uniform, they have an almost impossible job. It's like putting somebody there with a neon sign that says, "Shoot me first," if there's going to be an attack, because they know if they take out the one person in uniform, they're going to have free rein to go after other people that are there. Just read the manifestos, read the diaries. These guys go in extreme detail into explaining why they pick the targets that they do. They're not stupid. Their goal is to get media attention, and they know the more people they kill, the more attention they're going to get.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, and I do have great sympathy for the victims, families represented here. As a former felony judge, I've seen the worst of the worst, and anyway, heart goes out to you. The issue here is what to do about it. But Mr. Lott, do you have any statistics on what percentage of Americans want to see limitations on gun rights?
Yes, thank you very much. A lot of the surveys that have been mentioned so far, I think, are pretty misleading. So earlier it was mentioned about support for red flag laws, for example. And if you look at surveys, they'll go and say by 2 to 1, Americans support red flag laws. The problem is the way the questions are asked in all these things makes a huge difference. So for example, for red flag laws, they'll say, do you support judges being able to temporarily take away a person's guns who is a danger to themselves or others? And most people think that's reasonable. The problem is...
Well, actually, most places, that's the law.
Right, yeah, I understand. I mean, it's already the law even without red flag laws, because you have involuntary commitment and other types of laws. But the point is that if you merely tell them two things about red flag laws, that one, that there's no hearing that occurs before the judge takes away the weapons, and that there are no mental health care professionals involved in the process, unlike involuntary commitment, you end up going from 2-to-1 support to almost 2-to-1 opposition. Take something like...
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on that, but
Sure.
This is such a critical issue.
And the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Lott, I was looking in your written testimony, the part of it that you didn't get to elaborate on in your opening statement, and I noticed something remarkable, a sentence here that says there was no drop in the number of mass public shootings with assault weapons during the 1994 to 2004 so-called assault weapons ban. Can you elaborate on that? And one other thing I want to point out before I turn that over to you is one of the most horrific shootings in history was at Columbine, and it happened in 1999, 5 years into this the so-called assault weapons ban. But can you elaborate on whether mass public shootings went down or up? Because today I've heard several times it stated that the 94 to 2004 assault weapons ban worked, and it's being proposed again. So I think it's important that we get the data and to the document that the chair just introduced into the record. I want to say you are the only authority that we have here today on statistics and data. So if the other side would like to offer some facts or statistics and data, I would welcome them to bring a witness that's as knowledgeable as Mr. Lott on this subject at some time. And I ask Mr. Lott to answer the question. Microphone, please.
Just one quick thing. You know, you look around the world, people seem to think that this only happens in the United States. If you just compare even Western Europe to the United States, does anybody know where the two worst mass public shootings were? They were in Europe. France in November 2015 had 130 people killed. Norway, about a decade ago, had 67 people killed. France, it takes over a year to go through the licensing process. It costs thousands of dollars. You have to get 2 psychiatric evaluations to be able to go through. They have every law that every state in the United States has, plus more. And yet they've had worse mass public shootings on both total and per capita rates. Anyway, there are lots of different measures of mass public shootings. The only one that people look at who make this claim that the number of mass public shootings went down is by Louis Clarivas, who's at the Teachers College at Columbia. And what he does, he has a different measure than anybody else. He looks at 6 or more people killed rather than the typical 4 or more. But much more importantly, he inconsistently includes cases involving robberies or gang fights. So most of the measures, the FBI measure for active shooting or for mass public shootings, specifically measures public attacks that are not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight. They're trying to get at those cases where the whole point of the attack was simply to go and kill or harm other people. That's not saying that gang fights over drug turf aren't important, but the causes and solutions to going and stopping the types of mass public shootings that get people's attention in the news media are very different from the types of cases that you see that get the news coverage. The other thing that he does is you'd think he'd be looking at attacks involving assault weapons, but he lumps them together with all things. Well, even with his data, all the data shows that if it was a ban on assault weapons that was somehow causing a drop to occur, then the percentage of attacks involving assault weapons should have fallen when you have the ban, and then should have gone up. You know, if it's assault weapons that are driving the drop and then driving the increase after the ban sunset. But in fact, even with his data, what you find, because he lumps both assault weapons and other weapons together, even with his data, the increase that he claims occurs during the 94 to 2004 period is driven entirely by non-assault weapons being used more during that period of time. But anyway, it's pretty clear, no matter how you measure this, in fact, Clarivas was an expert in the California assault weapons ban case, where I was an expert on the other side, and the judge ruled that his evidence was contradictory and was not acceptable by the court.
Well, one thing also that seems somewhat disingenuous about this claim from the other side of the aisle is the number of AR-15s, so-called assault weapons or military-style weapons, that were in circulation and ownership in the United States practically doubled during that period because the manufacturers quickly changed the cosmetics. The ban was based on cosmetic features of the gun. And so the number of the people kept selling it. I bought an AR-15 between 1994 and 2004 myself because, in fact, they weren't really banned by function, only by style. So I think that deserves further investigation, whether that ban worked or not. It did not work, and I yield back. I thank the chairwoman, and thank you for having this hearing. I want to set one thing straight. It is true that President Biden has expressed his desire to ban all semi-automatic weapons. And most of the firearms sold today and most of the firearms owned today are semi-automatic weapons. So I think it's disingenuous to say that you don't want to ban guns or take them from people who are law-abiding citizens. The president didn't make an exception for law-abiding citizens when he said he wanted to ban semi-automatic weapons. Mr. Lott, you unearthed something that's very disturbing to me in your oral testimony. You said that the NICS background check results in racially disparate outcomes, that if you're a black male or Hispanic male, that you would be more likely to be denied, a law-abiding male, more likely to be denied the purchase of a firearm when you go to purchase it legally from a gun store. Why do you think that is? And what can we do in the next Congress to get the data to confirm that or to dispel that myth, if it is not true?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. It's a very simple point. You'll constantly hear things like there are 3.8 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. And that's simply false. What they should say is that there are 3.8 million initial denials, and about 99% of those are mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday from being able to go and buy a gun. And the problem is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. And the problem is that 18% of Hispanic males have a felony background. 34% of black males have a felony background. And the problem is, for whites, it's like 6%. For Asians, it's like 3%. And the problem that creates is that law-abiding, good black males or Hispanic males are more likely to have their names and birthdays confused with somebody who's prohibited because of this broad brush of using roughly phonetically similar names and birthdays, and it causes errors. Now, you can appeal. The problem is that it's a complicated process to appeal those mistakes, and it costs about $3,000 on up. And so what you've essentially done is good, law-abiding people who want to go and protect themselves and their family, poor and middle-income class people, are being prevented from buying guns through no fault of their own simply because they have a name similar to somebody who's prohibited. And there's a simple way of fixing this. If private companies did background checks in the same way that the federal government does, they'd be sued out of existence under federal law if they had an error rate that was 1/100th the error rate that the federal government has. Why not simply require that the federal government has to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? Now, when I was working in the Department of Justice, I tried to go and get the data on the error rates by race, but the FBI fought against us getting that at every step of the way that was there.
Isn't it true that that data is collected on every 4473 form that's filled out at a gun store?
Exactly.
Race.
You know the race, you know the sex of everybody there. We know who applied to get it to begin with. We know the rejection rate, even at the first stage, where the National BATF office goes through it. About 94% of the false positive cases are dropped at there are 5 stages of review. About 94% are dropped at the first stage review. There's no lawyers involved. They're simply double-checking the paperwork. The problem is they don't go back and tell people about the mistakes that were there. They just go, you're denied, and that's it. And you have to then go and appeal to go and get a mistake fixed then at that point.
Can you tell us about the laws that are on the books in all 50 states that resemble red flag laws, but actually help the person who may be a danger to themselves or others?
So they go by different names. Baker Act in California, 5150, in Florida, 5150 in California. What happens is if you are concerned that somebody's a danger to themselves or others, you go to the police will evaluate. If they have reasonable suspicion, they'll take the person into a psychiatric expert. If psychiatric experts can have 24 to 72 hours, depending on the state, to evaluate the person. At that point, if they think that there's a reasonable suspicion, there can be an immediate hearing. If the person can't afford a lawyer, one is provided for them at that time, and evidence can be cross-examined at that point. The thing is, at that point, judges have a broad range of options. They could say, look, I'm concerned. If you go and see a psychiatric expert after a week or 2 weeks, we will evaluate. They could take away the person's guns. Or in the ultimate thing, because about 99% of these cases are used for suicide concerns with red flag laws, you could involuntarily commit the person. The problem with red flag laws is no psychiatric experts, no mental health care experts are involved in the process. The only thing that the judge sees is a written complaint by maybe one person that's there. If you really believe somebody's suicidal, or you really believe somebody's a danger to themselves or others, just simply taking away their guns is not a serious solution to the problem there. If somebody's really suicidal, you're telling me there are not other ways that somebody can go and commit suicide? But the way these laws are set up is they want you to think if you only take away a person's guns, problem solved. There's no problem at that point. You know, people can drive a car into a crowded sidewalk that's there and go and kill people if they're really a danger to other people.
So before I yield back, just to clear that up, there are laws on the books in all 50 states that
And the
allow
federal
involuntary commitment and the taking of guns. But the difference between those laws is there's due process and the person receives treatment, whereas red flag laws, you just take the person's gun and leave them without treatment, and there's no due process. I yield back.
Gentleman has yielded time to Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey, you're recognized.
I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Burgess, for recommending actual solutions that could work. As he said, the debate on the Second Amendment will continue for as long as this country is a country, but we need to protect our kids now. Mr. Lott, are there school districts where teachers and staff can be armed? Can you talk about that, and what are the results there? How many victims have we seen in those school districts?
Right. There are 20 states that have that allow teachers and staff to carry. You have some states like Utah and New Hampshire where anybody with a concealed carry permit who's a teacher or staff member is allowed to carry. Most other states require a vote either by the school district board or by a decision by the principal of the school. And it varies a lot across it. Some states like Oklahoma and Ohio have had 40% of the school districts with it, and Texas is over 30%. But what you have is we've had a couple decades of experience with these things, and there is not, from 2000 on, despite many thousands of school districts having armed teachers and staff, there has not been one attack where anybody's been wounded or killed at any of these schools. And the other thing is, when you read the legislative debate, when these laws get passed, there's all these concerns. Well, the teacher will leave the gun, or the teacher will get upset and accidentally shoot somebody, or they'll shoot a bystander or something like that. You cannot find any of the mistakes that they're concerned about. I know of a couple accidental discharges where nobody's been hurt, basically, as a result of them. But nobody has been shot by a teacher. Nobody's gotten a hold of a teacher's gun and used it improperly, despite the concerns. So much of the debate about armed teachers, about things that might possibly go wrong, but we have thousands of schools and decades of experience to go and look to see whether or not those are likely outcomes or not.
I thank you. And Mr. Tiffany, I know you joined us remotely. Mr. Burgess would like some time. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Tiffany.